All right. Thank you all for being here. Um, let's look at some of the things that we found in the State of Biodiversity in Business report. So, the first finding that we have is that 80% of the people who responded to the report, and those are all people working at either large or mid sized companies, think that their companies are not doing enough when it comes to nature. So I think we all are very pleased to hear that because from that, we may not be pleased, but it may trigger more action in the future. And why is that? That's because we have found also in the data that nature and biodiversity is still at the bottom of the stack when it comes to overall sustainability priorities that companies have. And climate continues to be on the top of the stack. And, I think there are two ways to look at those data. On the one hand, we can say, well, biodiversity should be all the way up there because it's the foundation of all life on this planet and all business on this planet. But on the other hand, I think you could also say, look at it with the glass half full and say, well, only 2 years after the Global Biodiversity Framework has been passed, it's actually not that bad to have a quarter of companies see nature and biodiversity as a high priority. So, you can all pick your own interpretation, but I think those findings are interesting either way. And we're going to look at some of the details that came out of this, and I'm curious to see what our panelists think about them. So this next graph here talks about how companies are addressing their impacts on nature, and you can see that there's like a very wide range there. About 20% are not doing anything, about a quarter are forming a plan, then there are some companies doing some pilot projects, and another quarter kind of doing more significant interventions. Eva, I'm curious, you have been with Business for Nature trying really hard to get people from the beginning of this graph to the end of this graph and helping more companies do more meaningful action. How does this resonate with you? And how do you think we can change that?
Thanks so much. Thank you. And so great to be here. Really appreciate it. I actually think that is a very positive story because that means that only 20% right now aren't doing anything.
Yeah.
Right. So it means that we're on the journey already. And I do think that we've come so far, so fast. If I was in consulting speak, I'd say nature's on, like climate, supercharged. Because it's true when you think of the journey of businesses. Global Biodiversity Framework, and let's just dig into one example of Target 15, which I think a number of you have been very aware of, the assessment and disclosure. And look how the regulatory environment with CSRD, the stimulus from the Chinese 3 major stock exchanges, making it mandatory for companies to disclose on nature, these are sending signals that means we're going faster than ever. So for me, I feel like there are signals that, of course, the progress isn't fast enough, but there has been significant developments. We've got more than 450 companies now committed to adopt the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, 150 companies ready to use SBTN. We've got 26 strategies for nature on the It's Now for Nature campaign that's going to 2030, and that number is just going exponentially. And here in Cali, we have over 230 companies that are calling on governments for renewed policy ambition, because that change of the level playing field and the regulatory environment is what will get us to the scale. And the final thing I want to say in terms of this evolution and what this tells us is that, at the COP16, we were worried collectively after COP15, after such an amazing success, unprecedented business and finance representation. We were worried that nature might fall off the business agenda. But here we can say with confidence, nature has a confirmed seat at the business table. Can you imagine a company now saying, oh, nature was a priority, and you know what? We decided to sort of say it's not a priority anymore or not going to do anything anymore. No, it's a one-directional thing that's happening here. And there are more companies and financial institutions in Cali at COP16 than there were in Montreal. And that gives a strong signal of the direction to help shift this curve.
Yeah. And thank you so much for being like one of the main people and organizations in making all of that happen. So let's look a little bit deeper. We also ask people what kinds of commitments they've made in specific areas that are important to nature when it comes to land use, when it comes to water use, plastics and chemicals, and then also oceans. And we see that there's a lot more commitments on the land side than the water side. Circularity is a little bit, chemical and plastic is a little bit in the middle. Thomas, like from a practitioner point of view, I'm curious how this compares to your experience, like trying to get Unilever to act on these different levels. Why are we seeing those differences?
Well, thank you so much, Theresa, for having us here. It's wonderful to be here, and I'm sure you all share my admiration for the amazing leadership that Colombia, Cali, and particularly the COP president, Susanna Mohammed, has shown in bringing us all together here. I thought this was a fascinating slide for a number of reasons. Firstly, I think what I see in that slide is that where you have a connection to companies' climate transition plans, you see greater action. And that's, perhaps not a surprise. A lot of companies have done climate plans since the Paris Agreement or before. The 10 years, basically along that journey, if you've got an agricultural or a tropical commodity footprint, that is going to be part of your climate plan. So I think we've got to be a little bit kind to ourselves that, a 10-year run up on implementing some of that action is now being embedded into companies in a way that some of the other issues linked to biodiversity and nature are not yet there. I suppose the flip side of that is that even, you said here that these are companies that affect these systems.
Yeah.
You're barely seeing a majority of companies that say, yes, we have an impact on agriculture, we have an impact on forests, but somehow this is not part of our public commitments. And my only reading of that really is that companies have just found it easier to grapple with issues of the geosphere than the biosphere. If you're talking about where do we get our energy from and where do our suppliers get their energy from, it's a relatively straightforward conversation by comparison with the complexity of the sort of the web of life that supports us all and how we think about that infinite complexity. I had a fascinating experience earlier this week on a panel with Professor Zachary, who's one of the founding chairs of the IPBES, Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. If ever an acronym was necessary, IPBES is it. And he was unapologetic in his assertion that we've just got the prioritization wrong of climate versus nature, that the risk of biodiversity collapse is far greater than the risk of global warming. And I think in a lot of the conversations that I have privately with other corporate leaders in the sustainability space, that is a conversation people are having. Have we put too much emphasis on one versus the other? Not that we should do less on climate, but do we need to rapidly address that balance? And I think it is possible for companies to begin to engage even within that complexity. We've certainly found it's possible to craft, quite simple, clear targets that the business can mobilize around, whether that's, 1 million hectares of restoration and protection, 1 million hectares of regenerative agriculture. You can build in sort of proxy indicators for doing good stuff on nature that the companies can manage. And I think we need to look to mainstream those sorts of indicators in the way that climate targets have been mainstreamed through business.
Yeah. And I think like one thing to recognize also that this only asks about public commitments. I think there's a lot of like commitments behind the scenes that are not public, especially as more regulatory pressure is coming out on these systems. So that's something that we hear in conversations with within the Trellis network a lot. I'm curious about oceans. Oceans are so important, and I think companies are still really struggling to understand what to do about it. What do you think about those 18% of companies who are impacting oceans are having commitments?
I think that's absolutely the hardest. I worry more actually about the forest number being so low.
Yeah.
I mean, forests we all understand. Our oceans, people I think often don't understand what's going on there and why that matters. Forests, everybody intuitively knows why they're so critical, and yet to only see 38% of companies saying we're taking action on that. And I think there is a need to pivot the forest conversation from something that only companies that have a very obvious link to forests think, well, we'll get involved in there. There are all kinds of things that companies even not connected to forests can do. I don't know if there are folks here from the Leaf Coalition, really interesting new effort that launched at COP26 in Glasgow, providing a way for all kinds of companies to get into sort of systemic efforts for forest protection. And maybe we need something like that on oceans too. I don't know, but
Yeah. I was quite surprised about the forests as well, because deforestation has been around for so long and there's so much work happening in this space. All right. So the last kind of piece of data that we're going to look at is roadblocks. And my clicker is not working, so if someone can advance the slide, please. There we go. And so here we've asked people about what are the roadblocks that you're facing in like trying to get more attention and more action when it comes to nature and biodiversity. And you can download this report and and have it on your laptop later, and all the graphs are in there. So yeah, it was surprising to me to not see a big difference between these roadblocks in some ways. So people struggle with expertise and staff. They struggle with competing priorities for other sustainability goals that companies have. They're struggling with the lack of definitions and standard, and then also management commitments and like having clarity on what the financial returns are of doing this work. Geneva, does that resonate based on the work that you do with your clients at Deloitte, or does that make sense? And how do you help people address those roadblocks?
Well, certainly, I think you can hear me okay. Thank you. No?
No.
Oh, sorry. Grant,
it is
on. Here, can you switch? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for having me. When I looked at the data, what I actually saw was these are the standard talking points that we hear, right? We don't have enough people. We don't have enough skills, expertise. We're needing to use subcontractors, right? But many of these that are in your control, I think, are more of systems that organizations aren't dealing holistically and systematically with sustainability more broadly. So it's not just about nature and climate. It actually is about your broader sustainability strategy and how it is or is not tied to other drivers of value, and particularly shareholder value. And I'm going to get to that in a moment, because the one that also stuck out for me was the lack of consistent definitions, terms, measurement, reporting standards on nature and biodiversity. And many of us have often heard that story that, it's taken financial reporting 100 to 120 years to get here, so we need to be patient. In reality, when the GRI came out in the 1990s, there was already standard measurements and definitions around things like total water use, total land reclaimed. There have been these definitions over time, and perhaps too many standards, definitions that came out from that. But the international financial reporting standards didn't really become established until the early part of this century. And it's continually evolved. It's continually progressing as there's been new experiences and changes. Things like the financial crisis changed, modified it. We're also seeing the measurement of things like fair value, intellectual property. Accountants are relying on professional judgment and interpretations and different guidance to be able to determine actually what is that fair value definition itself. It's not dissimilar to what we're seeing with terms like biodiversity impact, ecosystem goods and services, and others. The thing is that very much like financial reporting, there is a continual learning and evolution and a maturity. And we are seeing that with the consolidation, the release of the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, ISB, and others. There's going to be new standards on human capital and natural capital coming out from the IFRS. So this is just actually how these things work. And I share this because I think it also is what we need to see when it comes to sustainability, is that the transformation that's needed to address aspects around insufficient capacity, skill sets. We need more proactive workforce planning. When it comes, this is the same experience with climate. So we need to think more holistically. We need to plan ahead and be proactive. We need to be looking at how are organizations defining value and defining value in a way that considers shareholder, natural, social, and human capital at the same time so that you can make trade-off. Thank you. Make trade-off decisions. But we can talk a little bit more about that because I have some ideas about how to get to the next level and that transformation that you need.
I would love to hear those from all of you. How do we get to the next level? And are there any kind of roadblocks that don't come up here that you think are really kind of important to highlight? Thomas or Eva?
Yeah, well, maybe building on what building on what you were just saying, Geneva.
Yeah.
I think we also have an issue which we've got to get over, which is that it is inherently quite complicated to understand and assess and value natural, social, and human capital. It's totally is doable, but just because the skills aren't in place or the resources aren't in place yet shouldn't be an excuse not to then do it. So I would push back. The other day, I was speaking to the CEO of a quite a big company and their chief sustainability officer, and we were talking about CSRD. And it's funny because it's a company that's done a lot and should be very well equipped to be able to then be ready for the CSRD. As we hear many companies saying, "Yeah, we've been leaning in on this, so actually when CSRD comes, we're well equipped." But it is a burden. It's a big lift. And the CSO was saying, "Oh, but now with CSRD, like we need a 20 FTE," it was the CEO saying, "Now we need a 20 FTE to be able to address this gap in resourcing, compared to previously with only a couple of people." And the reaction was, "So that's a problem," which I can understand. But you flip it on its head, you say, "So for your financial accounting and reporting, what's the size of your team? And would you be compromising on quality of that will drive the action?" Well, no, because you've gone through that transition internally. And this is a super painful transition that we're all part of, but it's a necessary one that we need to stick together, support the companies as we progress, because we've got headwinds with geopolitics, with inflation. There are other things obviously on people's minds. Let's not get stuck in it's too complicated because we've never done it before, but rather how do we support each other through this transition? And one of the mindset shifts that is a barrier that I think we all are a bit guilty of in this community is we can be so critical. We can be so critical of each other's methodologies, efforts, work. I'm not saying we shouldn't be rigorous. We should be, but we should also make sure that we are being positive and practical and not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. It's a classic expression, but it's one that we see so much. And similarly, we shouldn't be creating a competition between climate and nature. We know it's not, but then we keep on still slipping back into, well, actually, it should be all mixed up all together. So I think there's a mental brain of challenge and that we need to overcome here. And we can do it if we continue to be consistent and clear in what needs to happen, that we support the companies on that journey.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think one thing that companies need to understand is that, like right now, a lot of what I hear is that the internal sustainability resources are shifting from doing sustainability projects to doing CSRD. And that's not what we need. We just need like an expansion of the work. Thomas?
I wanted to come in on this point about the 20 FTE team, and those sorts of numbers you might be able to absorb in a Unilever, but a lot of the world is not big multinational companies. A lot of the world is small and medium-sized companies, or even big companies that wouldn't be able to cope with a 20-person addition overnight. And I do worry that sort of narrative might act as a barrier to leadership going, this is something we really need to do right now. And I'm a big believer in, you can do something. Yes, you can do very complex assessments of your corporate footprint, which big companies are doing. But like if you're a small and medium-sized company, you can probably intuitively get quite quickly to a sense of where are your big impacts. What are one or two things you could start doing now to get moving on this journey? And I mean, you said it already. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and we've just got to get going.
Yeah, and just to kind of dig a little bit deeper into that, do you have any kind of tips to share for how you've made the business case at Unilever to have expertise and have resources dedicated to nature and biodiversity?
Well, I think historically we've come on a kind of environmental journey that's been rooted in our supply chains, tropical commodities, palm oil, things like that, with known ecosystem impacts have been a focus for 20 years or so in the company. And so we've come at that, frankly, from a kind of reputation management, risk management issue in the early days, in the early 2000s, when you didn't want the association at all of being close to deforestation anyway. So that's driven that. But I think the rationale for doing it now is changing into a broader knowledge of the importance of biodiversity and ecosystems. But I think what the reason for doing it in your company may be different, but you've got to find the reason that works for you to engage and then build a business case around that.
Makes sense. Geneva.
I think a lot of organizations may see something like CSRD and ESRS as a compliance task, an administrative burden. I'm an eternal optimist, so I see it as such a great opportunity. These regulations are the expression of the public's expectations. Thanks. So I explained earlier, I have not spoken live since before COVID. It's so much easier just to have my little headset on sitting in front of a screen. So it is so much nicer. Believe me, I'm so glad to be here. It's so lovely to actually speak to live people and feel your energy. But yeah, I just think that there is an amazing opportunity if organizations can look at something like ESRS. They're going to find opportunities to streamline their business processes and find how to reallocate individuals to other tasks. For example, I worked with an organization where they had 8 people spending about 40 hours a month each, producing 8 reports of sustainability data internally that no one was reading. Awesome opportunity to put them to a different project, improve the controls, support, say, your new ESG controller, if that's a function that you're actually having. This is amazing. Think of your internal audit function. They love to be engaged. They love to be in service and of value. And so they could be the ones that could be helping in and doing pre-assurance, doing your process and your data mapping for those 1,000+ indicators and actually showing value to the organization. But they're often not tapped because they're not part of the sustainability team doing sustainability projects. Your supply chain team as well could be engaged. So your organization needs to be seen very much like an ecosystem. It is a living system. It is dynamic. It has a collection of parts, and every single part has a role to play in the sustainability transformation. There's your untapped people and talent with capabilities. That's going to address that. Showing that through your sustainability project, you're tying it to shareholder value. For example, if you improve workforce environments, and there is research for this, if you add plants in an office, you can add anywhere from 2 to 20% of worker productivity. That's something your CFO wants to hear about. But that may be a very, very small amount of investment. And you can get your workforce back into the office because of the environment itself. There are thousands of stories and data points and research that shows that if you think about it systematically and holistically, you can do it through a management system or other transformation project. But we have to move away from piecemeal individual projects, pilots, initiatives, etc. It has to be done in concert and progress over time. It's not a one and done.
All right. To wrap things up, Eva, are there any tools, resources that you'd like to point people to kind of make progress on developing a holistic nature strategy and get those projects going?
Yes. Thanks for asking. Good. And nowfornature.org. It's Now for Nature is a global campaign. We've got a nature strategy handbook. It's 12 pages. Check it out. It's available in multiple languages and it builds on all the existing tools out there. We know companies that have cut and pasted the key questions you should be asking yourself as you assess, commit, transform, disclose, and just bringing those into the executive teams or even board and discussing, are you ready with your strategy? Where is nature in your business strategy? So that is a tool. And maybe, I guess, just wrapping up on one takeaway is we have a very precious thing in the nature community, if you want, which is that we all actually talk a lot to each other and we not only talk but collaborate deeply, so that we can try and streamline and simplify and provide consistency, confidence, and clarity. I am overwhelmed by how much consistency, confidence, and clarity there is in the business world, and we are showing the way. Nature is now clearly established on the business agenda. What we need to be calling for also at COP16 is that businesses need to have their roadmap as part of the national strategies and action plans, the NBSAPs, to help us achieve the Global Biodiversity Framework. If governments provide that clarity of what the roadmap is, businesses will have the political certainty and can help plan themselves to contribute. Business has a disproportionately important role, and finance too, in this transition. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for that call out. All right, and with that, we're at the end of our session. Here is the QR code for you all to download the report and dig a little bit deeper into the findings, share them with your colleagues and friends. And please join me in thanking our panelists to help us make conflict.